South Africa, a land shaped by migration, conquest, isolation, and survival. And few groups in its history are more debated or more misunderstood than the Afrikaners. For centuries, people assumed they were simply descendants of Dutch colonists who arrived at the southern tip of Africa and remained mostly isolated from everyone around them. But where do the Afrikaners actually come from? Are they primarily European settlers descended from the Netherlands, Germany, and France? Or is the genetic story far more complicated, shaped by slavery, frontier mixing, indigenous African ancestry, and forgotten migrations across oceans? Scientists have been wrestling with this question for decades, and now DNA evidence is finally giving us answers. Some of them are genuinely surprising. Because the Afrikaner genetic story turns out to be one of the most layered colonial origin stories anywhere in the world. In this video, we're going to trace the origins of the Afrikaner people, from early Dutch settlers at the Cape Colony, through the violence and expansion of frontier South Africa, to the hidden Asian and African ancestry modern DNA studies uncovered inside the Afrikaner population itself. And along the way, we'll discover why the genetic origins of the Afrikaners challenge almost every stereotype people thought they knew. Today, there are roughly 3 million Afrikaners, most living in South Africa, with smaller communities in Namibia and across the global diaspora. They speak Afrikaans, a language that evolved at the southern tip of Africa from Dutch colonial roots, mixed with influences from German, French, Malay, Portuguese, indigenous African languages, and slave communities. And geography explains almost everything about their genetic story. The Cape of Good Hope sits at one of the most important maritime crossroads on Earth. For centuries, ships traveling between Europe and Asia stopped there for supplies and trade. That's not incidental. It's the reason Afrikaner ancestry became far more diverse than many people realize. Because the Cape Colony wasn't just a European settlement, it was a global contact zone. Dutch settlers arrived. German mercenaries and laborers followed. French Huguenot refugees fleeing religious persecution entered the colony. Enslaved people arrived from Madagascar, India, Indonesia, East Africa, and other parts of the Dutch colonial world. Indigenous Khoisan populations already lived there for thousands of years before Europeans appeared. And over generations, these populations mixed in ways the old history books often minimized or ignored. Here's what's interesting. Modern Afrikaners also became one of the most genetically studied populations in Africa because of unusually detailed church and genealogical records preserved over centuries. Scientists can trace many family lines remarkably far back, allowing researchers to compare written ancestry with actual DNA evidence. And there are physical and medical traits researchers notice too. Certain inherited disorders occur at elevated rates among Afrikaners because the early population remained relatively small for generations. That's what geneticists call a founder effect, when a small number of ancestors contribute disproportionately to later populations. But to understand the genetics, we first need to understand the language. Afrikaans belongs to the West Germanic language family, closely related to Dutch. At first glance, that seems straightforward. European settlers arrived from the Netherlands. Their language evolved locally. End of story. Except it wasn't that simple at all. Afrikaans developed faster and differently than most European colonial languages. It simplified grammar dramatically. It absorbed words from Malay, Portuguese, Kuko languages, Bantu languages, and slave communities from across the Indian Ocean world. And this is where it gets surprising. Linguists increasingly argue that Afrikaans wasn't created only by European settlers. Enslaved Asians, indigenous Africans, and mixed communities played a major role in shaping the language itself. In other words, even the language carried evidence of mixture from the beginning. But before we get to the DNA, we need to go back much further, to the people who were here first. Long before Europeans reached southern Africa, the region was home to some of the oldest human populations on Earth. Hunter-gatherer groups related to today's San people lived across southern Africa for tens of thousands of years, genetic studies consistently show that Khoisan-related populations preserve some of the deepest human genetic lineages known anywhere today. And physically, these early populations likely looked quite different from both later Europeans and later Bantu-speaking African populations who entered southern Africa more recently. Many carried lighter brown skin tones, distinctive facial features, and genetic adaptations shaped by arid environments over enormous stretches of time. Then came another major wave. Around 2,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking farming populations expanded southward across much of sub-Saharan Africa. They brought agriculture, ironworking, livestock, and new languages. Over centuries, they mixed with and sometimes displaced earlier hunter-gatherer populations throughout southern Africa. By the time Europeans arrived in the 1600s, southern Africa already contained a deeply layered population shaped by ancient hunter-gatherers, pastoral Khoikhoi groups, and Bantu-speaking agricultural societies. Then Europe entered the story. Now, unlike Europe itself, southern Africa didn't experience a Yamnaya-style Bronze Age steppe migration shaping local populations. But the Afrikaner population would emerge from another kind of migration entirely, one tied to empire, trade, and colonial settlement. In 1652, the Dutch East India Company established a refreshment station at the Cape under Jan van Riebeek. The colony began small, very small, and that's important. Because most modern Afrikaners descend disproportionately from a surprisingly limited number of founding individuals. Historians long assumed the population remained overwhelmingly Dutch and European in origin. But when scientists looked at the DNA, they found something different. A major genetic study from researchers at Stellenbosch University and the University of Pretoria found that nearly every Afrikaner tested carried at least some non-European ancestry, often inherited from the earliest colonial generations. That's remarkable. The history books often described Afrikaners as an isolated white settler population. But genetically, the story was more complicated from the very beginning. One of the most important forgotten influences came through slavery. The Dutch imported enslaved people from Indonesia, India, Madagascar, Mozambique, and East Africa. Many male settlers arrived without European wives during the colony's early decades. Relationships formed across ethnic and social boundaries, especially in the earliest colonial period. Over generations, some descendants became absorbed into the growing Afrikaner population itself. And this is where it gets even more surprising.